I would ask this question to my friends on Catholic YouTube, but it seems like most of Catholic YouTube is composed of converts. So I'm asking you, my audience, when you were growing up, what did you learn about cremation? Did you learn anything at all? Is this mostly a trad thing? What I remember is that my parents would make a very big deal about how they did not want to be cremated, how they didn't want us to be cremated. Cremation might be okay for certain people, like if you couldn't afford a full burial, or if you died during like some kind of time of pandemic and you needed to be cremated in order to avoid the spreading of disease. But that's about it. And really, all Catholics should be avoiding cremation like the plague. In today's video, I'll be exploring Catholic teaching on cremation over time, seeing how it changed, and then posing a question to my Catholic friends. This question has to do with a topic that I am still deeply confused about, and I really hope that you will be able to help answer that question for me. Let's jump into it. Before we start the kind of historical look at the Catholic teaching on cremation, I think a good place to start is to ask a priest. Luckily, a couple of priests on the internet have already answered this question for me. Father Gruner, the founder of the Fatima Center, I think states it in the way that I heard it growing up. I think that he essentially sums up the general attitude about cremation that was present at my parish. At around 3 minutes and 26 seconds into this video, Father Gruner says that if you really understand Catholic teaching, then cremation is not an option for you.
Well, I think that they shouldn't do it. And, you know, and I think that, now, is it an option? Well, the question comes down to, if you really understand it, I don't think it is an option for you. But if you're not entirely well formed on this subject, and you go by what canon law says, you are maybe not subjectively guilty for doing this when you don't have to do it. But really I would say, you're asking me? No.
Father Gruner, of course, is not the only priest on Catholic YouTube. Father Schmidt says the following.
In the 60s, 1960s, the church said, okay, we know that there are very few people right now, maybe there are some people out there, but it's not the dominant cultural mindset that says I'm going to be cremated because I want to free my soul from my body. Therefore, the church said, okay, well, the culture has changed. Therefore, as long as you treat the cremated remains, or the cremains, that's actually a term, the cremains with dignity, meaning inter the body in the ground, in sacred ground, then cremation is allowed. It's never recommended, but it's allowed.
And that was a very nuanced take. Whew. Okay. There's other priests too. Father Casey says something kind of similar. Listen to what Father Casey has to say.
In short, the church began to realize that there could be many reasons for the practice that did not contradict our faith.
And by the way, I will never get used to calling a priest by their first name, but I legitimately don't know Father Casey's last name. And then lastly, let's actually read something from Father Boyle of the SSPX. You can see here that I am at the SSPX website, link in the description down below, but we'll be reading an article called, Is Cremation Forbidden by the Catholic Church? And this is answered by Father Leo Boyle. Father Boyle writes, at no period in the history of Catholicism was the practice of cremation ever adopted or favored in the Catholic Church. From the very beginning, burial of the dead as an inhumation was an inviolable practice in the church, and she struggled constantly against cremation, a pagan custom, often accompanied by rites incompatible with the Catholic faith. Skipping down a little bit, cremation itself is not intrinsically evil, nor is it repugnant to any Catholic dogma, not even the resurrection of the body, for even after cremation, God's almighty power is in no way impeded. No divine law exists which formally forbids cremation. The practice is, however, in opposition to the constant, unbroken tradition of the church since its foundation. And then the rest of the article goes on to outline a couple of the historic reasons why cremation is indeed opposed to the constant, unbroken tradition of the church. Okay, so perhaps unsurprisingly, we see that there's this gradient from like the SSPX all the way to Father Casey, where the SSPX is pretty much like, yeah, no, it's not really an option if you truly understand the teaching. And Father Casey seems to pretty much say like, hey, look, as long as you're not doing it for the express reason of like trying to like, promote paganism, then you're fine. So that's a little confusing. How did we get here? How did we get to this place of confusion? Well, cremation is older than the Catholic Church, but I think where I'm going to start is actually in the year 1300, on the 21st of February in the year 1300. For this section, I am reading from the Catholic Encyclopedia, available in full from newadvent.com. This is the entry on cremation, linked in the video description below. The section on cremation in the Catholic Encyclopedia starts with a brief history of cremation, saying that it dates back to, we have records of it as far back as 2500 BC. However, the part that I'm interested in reading starts in the section called In the Middle Ages, because the Middle Ages is when the church started having, I guess, at least we have more records of what the church actually ruled on. Over the course, or once in the course of the Middle Ages, did there seem to be, on part of some, a retrogression to the pagan ideals. What this means is the practice of cremation had largely fallen out of fashion from the 7th century or so until the, the 13th century-ish. But then it started to come back. And as a consequence, Pope Boniface VIII, on the 21st of February, 1300, in the 6th year of his pontificate, promulgated a law which was in substance as follows. They were ipso facto excommunicated who disemboweled bodies of the dead or inhumanely boiled them to separate the flesh from the bones, with a view to transportation for burial in their native land. Destinate feritatis abusam, he calls it. And it was practiced in the case of those of noble rank who died outside of their own territory and expressed a wish to be buried at their place of birth. So what would happen is somebody with money would want to be buried in his home city, but he was off fighting a war somewhere else when he died. Well, it was normal at that time, and this sounds kind of gross, but they would boil the bodies so that only the bones were left. Now, think about it. If you cremate a body, there's no bones left, but they want their bones to be buried at least in their home country. So they would boil the bodies so that the bones would remain, but nothing else would. And they would pick out the bones. And now, because you have to travel for, thousands of kilometers from wherever you're fighting this war back to your home city, do you want to be dragging a decomposing body with you? Probably not. So you'll boil the body where you're at, and then you'll put the bones in a bag, and you can just kind of like carry the bones with you. It's cleaner, it's less smelly. There's I guess a lot of benefits to transporting bones rather than an entire body. And to be honest, I imagine that the body would decompose by the time that you were back anyway. So that was a common practice. And Pope Boniface VIII, in the year 1300, promulgating a law that said that anybody who does that is ipso facto excommunicated. You excommunicate yourself if you order your body to be boiled after you die, or even, I think, if you partake in it. That isn't exactly the same thing as cremation. However, if it's ipso facto excommunicable to boil your body such that the flesh is removed but the bones remain, it seems even worse for you to not even allow the bones to remain, as what would happen when you cremate a body. And so most trad Catholics will point to this law promulgated by Boniface VIII as the first official ruling on cremation, because it should cover cremation if it covers boiling the bodies. I'm going to jump forward a couple hundred years, actually, to the 19th century for the next little historical piece of information about cremation that I would like to share. And in order to share this, I am going to read from Church Militant. May she rest in peace. We will miss you, Church Militant. Anyway, this is from an article called Pope's Doctrine CZAR Stirs Controversy on Cremation. I'm going to skip down to this section right here. In May of 1886, the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office, the former name of the DDF, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is supposed to be part of the ordinary magisterium, so like it's really important what the DDF says, ordered the excommunication of Catholics belonging to organizations advocating cremations. Pope Leo XIII ratified this decree 7 months later, in December of 1886, depriving Catholics who asked for cremation of a Catholic burial. And in 1892, priests were ordered not to give such Catholic the last rites. No public funeral mass could be said for them. Only in the exceptional circumstance of a plague or a health epidemic did the church permit cremation. So you can see here that from the 14th century through to the 19th century, cremation remained an excommunicable offense. Excommunication is serious. I understand that it was never dogma, but we were excommunicating people over it. We were telling you, if you die, you will go to hell. Excommunications are not like Pope Boniface VIII went out of his way, right, to tell everybody that it's serious enough that it's excommunicable, but it's not dogma, so it can change, right? Okay, all right. It's not dogma. It was never dogma. It was doctrine that was excommunicable. That's how powerfully that doctrine was held. I don't think that should be understated. Now we're going to look at one more source, a pre-Vatican II source, to see how cremation is treated. That last source that we're going to be looking at is the 1917 Code of Canon Law. Again, canon law is not dogma. Canon law can change. This has changed since 1917. However, I think that looking at canon law is just good to see something that's very cleanly spelled out, probably in a more direct way than things like papal bulls and such. The first canon that we are going to look at is Canon 1203. This is on the section called On Ecclesiastical Burial, and you can read that like on a Catholic burial. So, the bodies of the faithful departed shall be buried, and their cremation being reprobated. Something being reprobated is like we should disprove of that thing. So, bodies of the faithful departed shall be buried, and we disprove of their cremation. If anyone by any manner orders that his body be cremated, it is illicit to execute that desire. And if this was added to any contract or testament or any other act, it is considered as not being added. So not only should you not get your body cremated, but if your loved one asks for their body to be cremated, you shall not obey that desire. You have to disrespect their final wishes. You know, because this is a very serious sin, I suppose. The last one is Canon 1240. I'm just going to scroll a little bit to get there. Again, the full document is linked in the description down below. Canon 1240. Unless they gave before death a sign of repentance, the following are deprived of a Catholic burial. Notorious apostates. That might be bad news for me, although I'm not notorious yet, right? So that's good. People who have been excommunicated. Those who have killed themselves by deliberate counsel. Yeah, we're denying those people Catholic burials. Those who died in a duel or from wounds related thereto. I guess that's kind of funny. Like, duels were popular enough that we had to have a special rule about them. Those who ordered their body be handed over for cremation, and other public and manifest sinners. So, those who order their body be handed over for cremation are listed among a list of public and manifest sinners, and they are to be denied a Catholic burial. Again, I understand that the Code of Canon Law is something that can change, and it's not dogma, but I do think that looking at this Code of Canon Law is just a really good way for me to show you that from at least 1300 until at least 1917, church teaching was clear. And if you remember, the SSPX article said that tradition has been consistent and clear on the issue of cremation. The SSPX is correct. The church was consistent and clear on cremation until the 1960s. In 1963, the Holy Office put out Piam et Constantem, a encyclical, I believe, that relaxed the teaching on cremation. This practice, the practice of cremation, was meant to be a symbol of antagonistic denial of Christian dogma, above all, of the resurrection of the dead and the immortality of the soul. Such an intent clearly was subjective, belonging to the mind of the proponents of cremation, not something objective and inherent in the meaning of cremation itself. Cremation doesn't affect the soul, nor prevent God's omnipotence from restoring the body. Neither does it itself include an objective denial of the dogmas mentioned. Therefore, it's not an intrinsically evil act. It's not opposed per se to the Christian religion. This has always been the thinking of the church, says the church in 1963. In certain situations where it was or is clear that there is an upright motive for cremation based on serious reasons, especially of public order, the church did not and does not object to it. There's been a change for the better in attitudes in recent years. More frequent and clearer situations impeding the practice of burial have developed. Consequently, the Holy See is receiving repeated requests for a relaxation of church disciplines relative to cremation. And so with this document, the church did relax teaching on cremation. Now, you heard me slip some words in there. I said, according to the church in 1963. And why did I say that? In 1963, the church claimed that the church has always had this view that, like, cremation per se is fine. It's just bad when people are using it as an antagonistic denial of Christian dogma. That's the bad part. And prior to 1963, all cremation was an antagonistic denial of Christian dogma. But that doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, go back to Pope Boniface VIII. He was ipso facto excommunicating people who were boiling bodies to bring the bones back to their home country, their home city, for burial. I mean, there's nothing antagonistic about that. Presumably, these people are like, Italians who were like fighting a war in France or something like that, like Christians in a different Christian, so they're traveling a far distance. That was worth ipso facto excommunication. So I don't think it's true that this practice was meant to be a symbol of antagonistic denial of Christian dogma. Certainly not in all cases. Now, I have actually been reading a book called Purified by Fire, A History of Cremation in America, and I'll go ahead and I'll put some quotes from that book up on the screen now. But the author, by the way, this book was published by the University of California, not a particularly well-known Catholic university. So I don't think it's biased. And the author says that there were actually a decent amount of Freemasons in the latter half of the 19th century who were kind of giving a final to the church by having their bodies cremated. So the DDF statements in the late 19th century and the 1917 Code of Canon Law very well may have been a reaction to people going like this to the church and getting their bodies cremated. But whether or not that is the case, the Code of Canon Law of 1917 does not mince words. It says never. It says you can't do this. It's never to be suggested. It's never the primary path forward. The way that I think about it is like, imagine the church flipped on abortion and then was like, well, the church has always allowed abortion for the life of the mother. And you're like, well, yeah, of course the church has always allowed abortion. If the mother and the baby are going to die, then abort the baby to save the mother. That's okay. That's always been the position of the church. But the church has never said, yeah, go ahead and get abortions. Likewise, the church has never said, yeah, go ahead, go get cremated. The only time cremation was ever okay was like if there's like a plague and like you need to cremate the bodies, or like a war, like a huge battle and it's just not feasible to bury all the bodies. Fine, you can burn bodies after a huge battle or during a plague, and that's about it. Not even to bring your bones back home to your home country. So I just don't think that it's correct to say that it was always meant to be a symbol of antagonistic denial of Christian dogma, though it certainly was sometimes an antagonistic denial of Christian dogma. I just don't think it was always. And so I don't really understand what Piam et Constantem is saying in that very first paragraph. I find it confusing. Maybe I'm just not very bright, but I find it confusing. And I mean, apparently a lot of trad organizations like the SSPX also find it confusing. Now that we have seen the history of Catholic teaching on cremation and how that teaching has changed over time, I want to bring up a quote from that SSPX article that we looked at towards the beginning of this video. No divine law exists which formally forbids cremation. The practice is, however, in opposition to the constant, unbroken tradition of the Church since its foundation. Can this not be said about a lot of issues that modern Catholics view as like pseudo-dogmatically wrong? Very few church teachings are church dogma, right? Only a select few things are dogma, like shockingly few, right? So something like the Nicene Creed is dogma, and the dogma of the perpetual virginity of Mary and the Assumption, those are dogma, but that's kind of it. There's more than that, right? But not a shocking amount. It seems like the vast majority of church teaching is doctrine, not dogma. And that made me think of a question, one that I can't really answer. At least I don't think I have the answers to it. I've set up a symmetry argument here. I'm going to state something that is true about cremation. I think it's true. I think I demonstrated that the following statement is true about cremation. And then I'm going to swap out the words cremation for gay marriage. And I'm going to see if the same argument holds. And if it doesn't hold, well, then I need to see some kind of symmetry breaker to see why it wouldn't. Here we go. Sure, for over 1900 years, the unbroken tradition of the Catholic Church is that cremation was not allowed. And it was even at times an excommunicable offense. But never in the history of the Catholic Church was cremation ever dogmatically banned. The only dogma which exists are for a select few things, of which cremation is not one. So that means that, though the teaching of the Church has been consistent and unbroken for 1900 years, that doesn't make something dogma, and so the teaching on cremation is only doctrine. Doctrine can be refined, and indeed, church teaching on cremation has been refined to a better understanding. Where in the past, cremation was a sign of being explicitly not Catholic, it was a sign of your paganism, perhaps, that's simply not true today. And so the Church, in her wisdom, relaxed her teaching on this matter to allow Catholics to be cremated. Now I'm going to simply sub the words cremation for gay marriage, change some verb tenses, and state the same thing. And I'm going to ask what the symmetry breaker is. Sure, for 1900 years, the unbroken tradition of the Church was that gay marriage and gay relations are not allowed, and have been at times an excommunicable offense. But never in the history of the Church were gay relations or gay marriage ever dogmatically banned. The only dogma that exists are like a select few teachings, and gay marriage has never been something that has been dogmatically ruled on. Which means that church teaching on gay marriage is doctrine, not dogma, despite the fact that church teaching has been consistent and unbroken for over 1900 years. Doctrine can be refined, and indeed, church teaching on gay marriage has been refined, assuming that it has been refined in the future, to a better understanding, where in the past, gay relations and gay marriage was a sign of being explicitly non-Catholic. Consider Rome in ancient pagan Rome, it was quite normal for the pagans to well, I guess kind of be bisexual, but that's besides the point. Today, it's simply not the case that being married to somebody of the same sex is a sign that you're explicitly not a Christian. That's just not the case anymore. And for this reason, the church, in her wisdom, has relaxed her teaching on this matter and now allows Catholics to marry people of the same sex. So my question is as follows. What am I missing here? Am I missing some symmetry breaker between cremation and gay marriage where it's making the one more unchangeable than the other? I assume that there is and that I'm just not seeing it. And so if there is, please let me know. If there isn't, though, and like theoretically what I said could come to pass, then I guess it can change. How much change in Catholic sexual ethics would you be able to handle before you called into question just the whole notion of infallibility in the first place? That is what happened to me. I started to call into question the whole notion of infallibility in the first place, to the point where there was a brief period of time where I was both Catholic and I just thought that infallibility is a shell game. Like, it just, the church isn't infallible. But that phase didn't last very long. Pretty soon after that, I was no longer Catholic. Let me know your thoughts here. Please point out to me my error where there might be one. And thanks for watching.